By thunder, it was only a matter of time before I turned to piracy, and you can lay to that. Arr! Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and we'll be talking about pirates for a while. In fact, this is what I would call pirate winter. I knocked out one of my teeth and decided to make the best out of it, and that is talking about a bunch of pirate books until I get it fixed. So we'll be talking about Treasure Island today, and then we'll be talking about On Stranger Tides by Tim Powers later, and we'll be talking about The Pirates by George MacDonald Fraser, and possibly The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by Sheldon Chakraborty, and other pirate books, as long as I can come up with some that interest me. That's the plan, and maybe we'll talk about actual historical pirates as well. So, with all that out of the way, I want to bring out a cheers to one of my new channel members. In this case, Ida. This one's for you. Cheers. And in case you're wondering, I'm of course drinking grog because, you know, pirates. Anyway, let's get started. I'll give you a quick introduction to Treasure Island in case you need that. And then we'll talk about why this book is important, why it is special, all the other things that it does that other pirate books have taken away from it. So, let's get started and talk about, well, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, published in 1883. Well, it is the story of one young Jim Hawkins who comes into possession of a treasure map of the treasure of the notorious pirate Flint, and together with Dr. Livesey and Squire Trelawney makes a journey into the South Sea to find that treasure. Unfortunately, some of Captain Flint's old companions are also looking for that treasure, and from there on out, adventure ensues, as they say. It's probably the most influential and most well-known pirate story that has been around until Pirates of the Caribbean, possibly even still. So I think it's worthwhile talking about it. Yeah. If you haven't read it yet, it's a classic, go read it. It's definitely worth it. If you're interested in pirates at all, you'll recognize a lot of stuff just from this specific book. And one final thing, the notorious pirate accent, the R, actually comes not from pirates, but from the first, or not even the first, but from one specific 1950s Treasure Island movie adaptation, and Robert Newton, the actor for Long John Silver. He came from, well, West Cornwall, and used his specific West Cornish accent for the character, and that's where we got the pirate accent from. I just want to mention that because it's interesting how sometimes one specific choice in media adaptation, or just media, does influence how we see entire groups of people. The other option, important example for that is, of course, dwarves speaking Scottish, which is basically just because Paul Anderson decided to give his dwarf Yugi a Scottish accent in Three Hearts and Three Lions, and ever since then, dwarves speak Scottish. With that out of the way, let's talk about a number of things that make Treasure Island an important book. And the first part is that I want to talk about it as a children's book, and then I want to talk about historical influences and how Stevenson put them in there, because we'll come back to that with the other books that we'll talk about. So let's start with this being a children's book, which it is. And that's not, you know, evident in the beginning, because children's books are not as old as you might think. In fact, children's books are more or less an invention of the late 19th century. Obviously, children before that could sometimes read and got the opportunity to read, but they were reading stories that were also written for adults. A specific genre of children's books is an invention of the Romantic era, the 19th century, and well, it needs certain things. It needs a lot of schooling, it needs literacy for children. It also needs, the idea that childhood is something to be preserved. So in the 19th century, this is mostly upper middle class children, of course, because, you know, everyone else had to, you know, stick their fingers into steam-driven looms to further capitalism. However, in the 19th century, we get that, and partly that is fairy tales like the ones written by George MacDonald, and partly it's pirate stories like these written by Robert Louis Stevenson. That leads to certain things that make it specifically a children's book. One of them is, of course, the structure. And we have a young protagonist. In fact, for the largest part of the story, he's the actual narrator. That is Jim Hawkins, who's very, you know, is a boy, which, you know, helps young readers to identify with the book with the character and the story. In fact, the book was published in installments in a magazine for young readers at the time, and it was originally told by Robert Louis Stevenson to his adopted son Lloyd around a treasure map that Lloyd probably had drawn. So it is very explicitly made for children. And it tackles, the problems that children have. In fact, it's oftentimes Jim's action as a kid that drives the plot. In fact, there's like 3 times at least where it's Jim doing things, and some others. Jim is the first person to befriend, or at least, talk to Bill Bones, the old sea dog at the Benbow Inn. Jim's the one who hides in the apple barrel and hears about the plot. Jim's the one who jumps ship with the pirates and witnesses the first murder on Treasure Island, and Jim's the one who leaves the stockade and thus frees the Hispaniola and all of those things. What is interesting about that is that at least in 2 of these cases, Jim's actively disobeying orders or expectations of his betters, and that's very much something we see in a lot of children's stories or young adult stories. The conflict that you are in as a child with your parents is something that often comes up because you try to find your way around, you're constantly testing rules, and those have consequences. We learn that with Jim having, doing these things and then feeling bad, and there are often, there are actual consequences for his actions outside of what he does. But at the same time, he does, of course, propel the plot. Without Jim's disobedience, everything would have turned out much different. No one would have known about the plot by the pirates. No one would have, learned about Ben Gunn. No one would have, all of these things would not have happened. So while making it clear that disobedience is wrong, it also showcases that initiative is something that that growing children need to learn at some point and do things on their own. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out with Treasure Island. The other part is, of course, that children's literature, and in a way also literature for women, which is another thing that happens more clearly in the 19th century, were expected to adhere to specific social norms. In fact, the term bowdlerizing comes from that, with one good man, Bowdler, deciding to cut the works of William Shakespeare and take out all the sex and violence so it would not, distress young readers and tender female minds. And we can see that with Treasure Island in particular, because while it does have some violence, it has no sexual connotations whatsoever, and it does also leave out some clear explicit violence that would be common for other pirate stories, even from earlier times and later times. And it does, of course, also clearly propel Victorian morals in a lot of other ways, including, of course, praising the British Empire and other elements of obedience, military structure. All of those things are once again sort of praised in a lot of ways. So that's another part that I think is important to see when this is that this is a 19th century children's book with certain didactic elements tied to it. It's supposed to entertain, but it's also supposed to educate people in some ways. Those are the first things that I wanted to talk about when it comes to this being a children's book. Now let's talk about history and realism and other stuff. The first thing to note here is that pirates have always been mythologized. Pirates have been around forever. In fact, ever since the second person figured out how to float on a log and take stuff away from the first person who found out how to float on a log, pirates have been around. But when we talk about pirates today, we usually think of what is usually called the golden age of piracy, that being the late 17th and 18th century, huge sailing ships, cannons, sabers, the whole thing, right? And those have always been mythologized. There are, in fact, some early sources on pirates, those being a general history of the pirates from 1724 being probably one of the key texts, and certainly the most influential one for Treasure Island. It was written by supposedly a Captain Charles Johnson, who is fictitious. It has often been ascribed to Daniel Defoe, who probably didn't write it, but wrote some other stories about pirates. And there are, other candidates. It doesn't actually matter who wrote it. What it contains is a series of basically biographies of famous pirates, including someone like Edward Teach or Thatch, Blackbeard. It includes Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the most famous, female pirates. It includes Calico Jack Rackham and others. And those are already heavily fictionalized narratives about these characters. There are other sources. There is, of course, a story, the history of the American buccaneers by a Dutch surgeon who lived amongst the buccaneers, who then got sued by Henry Morgan for calling him a pirate, which is interesting in numerous ways. And, other texts like that. All of these already heavily fictionalized the idea of piracy. And this has, remained with us ever since. In fact, I would argue that pirates are, in a lot of ways, a modern mythology, or this specific form of pirates or piracy is a modern myth, in that it deals with all kinds of complicated aspects of life through the lens of these adventure stories. And that has always been the case, because there have been ballads, there have been broadsheets, there have been comic operas, there have been dramas, musicals, everything ever since, the late 17th century around pirates. And Robert Louis Stevenson does, of course, call back to those and use these as influence. In fact, we find a lot of, real-world pirates mentioned within Treasure Island. Blackbeard is obviously mentioned, Avery is mentioned, Henry Avery being an especially interesting one we'll probably talk about when we talk about The Pirates by George MacDonald Fraser. English, Captain English is mentioned. A lot of Henry Morgan is, of course, mentioned. All of these characters are mentioned. Especially interesting case is, of course, Israel Hands, who is a more important character in Treasure Island, being the one that Jim actually kills. And Israel Hands is a historical character. He shows up in the general history of the pirates, being a possibly quartermaster or another person in the crew of Blackbeard, who got shot in the knee and wounded in the knee by Blackbeard, and thus did not go down with Blackbeard when Blackbeard famously died in 1718. We'll also talk about that one when we talk about On Stranger Tides. And so we can see Robert Louis Stevenson taking real-world inspiration for his book and taking out some of the violence. The other, of course, important and key part of treasure stories, of pirate stories, is buried treasure. Treasure Island has, obviously, buried treasure, and it has a map, all of these things that we have come to very much believe in. Those are more of an invention of the Americas, of an American story. Digging for buried treasure is obviously something that people have always done, but in the early 19th century it became a real craze, so to speak, in North America, because there have been instances of pirates burying their treasure, Captain William Kidd being one of them. William Kidd, obviously a buried treasure that was dug up a long time ago, and then there's, of course, the legendary money pit that has shown up everywhere since then, and no one knows what's actually in there. You can find, apparently, rings that make you bulletproof if you play Assassin's Creed, and so forth, in that thing. So the idea of digging for pirate treasure is something that has been around for a long time, and it has been fictionalized. You find it in Washington Irving's The Money Diggers, which is a story about exactly that, and not finding buried treasure. And these stories often were about not finding the treasure and figuring out that hard work is actually more important than, hoping for buried treasure. But once again, they speak to a historic reality in the early 19th century. In fact, one character that often comes up when you read up about buried treasure and pirate treasure and so forth is one Joseph Smith Jr., who helped dig for buried treasure. Yes, I can't even escape the fucking Mormons when I talk about pirates. It's a thing. And anyway, so we see that part also, and this is not without a reason. Robert Louis Stevenson, being Scottish, however, traveled to the United States, traveled to America, and also to the South Sea, and married an American woman and adopted her son. And Treasure Island does combine those two elements, the American sort of specific interest in buried pirate treasure, because of course a lot of pirates, on the Spanish Main and the Caribbean and so forth, had connections to British colonies and then later obviously the burgeoning United States, and dug up, hoarded some of their treasure there. We'll come back to that once again when we talk about On Stranger Tides. And he takes these elements, the American elements about buried treasure, and the British elements about British people leaving the British Navy, turning pirates and so forth, and combines them into one story. This is a broad element here. There's obviously more to this, and that's what we're going to talk about next. You may have heard the word buccaneer before, and the word buccaneer is specific. It is, in fact, a term that has a similar word combined with it, and that is barbecue. It referred to a process of drying meat and salted meat in the sun, basically creating jerky. And buccaneers were people who had jumped ship or fled slavery or other situations and were doing that hunting in, well, either on the Southern American continent or on the islands, and drying meat in the sun. Those were buccaneers. Which makes it interesting that Long John Silver is called barbecue by his mates in Treasure Island. Yes, he's the cook, which, could be one explanation, but also barbecue would mean that he did barbecue, which is something that buccaneers did. Just one of those situations where we can see Robert Louis Stevenson take a lot of inspiration from real-world pirate facts that he learned from, probably the general history of the pirates and some other books. So that's one thing. The next interesting thing where Treasure Island does, however, slowly divert from real history is, of course, disobedience, Navy discipline, and all of that. A lot of things we learn about pirates is that they jump ship after being press-ganged into, say, the Merchant Marine or the Marines, the Navy, and because of very harsh discipline, and, well, life as an official merchant marine sailor, merchant sailor, or a Navy sailor was pretty fucked up at the time. Painful, harsh discipline, very bad food, all of that. Piracy could offer an alternative to that. We see some small elements of this in Treasure Island when some people complain about hazing, which is, where the term kind of comes from. But it's very, very limited. We don't see anyone being tortured or whipped or anything of the sorts, because it turns out it's a children's book, and the Navy guys around Captain Smollett are, of course, the good guys in this book. But it's something that I wanted to bring up to see how Stevenson does change reality for this book slowly away from that. Another part is, of course, race. Now, there are stories about how multiracial and inclusive pirate society was. Depending on who you talk to, those stories change, but it is definitely clear that pirates were a very multi-ethnic society, having runaway slaves and Maroon societies, those being, runaway slaves in different islands in the Caribbean, having people from France, England, Spain, all kinds of places, obviously in the Netherlands, like Dutch people and so forth, joining these groups. So they are not just British people. That's clear. Treasure Island only has British people in it. That's like one thing that already shows where this is going, because this is the 19th century. It has only one black character in it, and that's only mentioned twice, and that is Long John Silver's wife, being a black woman. Now, we don't hear anything beyond that, so it's difficult to call it, like, there's no racism in that regard. It just is interesting that the one black person is linked to pirates. Although, Britain and the British Empire in the late 19th century were certainly not as white as you might think. There are black people living in England in the 19th century. There are all kinds of other people from different ethnicities living there, but this book is incredibly white in that regard. Another thing that I wanted to bring up here. Now let's talk about the Empire, because I think that's the final part that we need to be aware of when we talk about Treasure Island. Piracy and imperialism and colonialism have a very interesting relation. In a lot of ways, pirates have often been framed as people opposed to imperialism, fleeing imperialism, living outside of either the Spanish or the British Empire, opposing the Spanish Empire, opposing the British Empire, and so forth. This is not necessarily correct. We'll talk about that more in the next couple of videos, I'm sure. But it certainly is one way of looking at this, and piracy has always been connected to building empires, and whether you are against it or before it, you're kind of tied to that if you're a pirate in the Caribbean in the 17th or 18th century. So it is interesting that this book, written in the 19th century, near the end of the 19th century, does not actually look into that at all. Well, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because in 1883, the British Empire is the fucking empire. There's nothing else out there. So that specific sort of dialogue, this discourse around empire has been wiped away. In fact, the British Empire is basically the good guys in this book, more or less. And this is something that I wanted to look at for a second, because yes, while this is certainly the case, and everyone on the side of the good guys has been fighting for the British Empire, Squire Trelawney has clearly been in the military, and some of the battles that he's taken part in are mentioned. Same for Dr. Livesey, and obviously Captain Smollett has been a Navy captain before, so we have all of these people. We even see their patriotism mentioned multiple times, with Smollett hoisting the British flag as soon as they go to the stockade. And this is sort of where things get interesting, because this is not all good, right? This is not all good, because once they put up the flag, they are good targets for the cannons on the ship. So there is a hint, if you want to look at it this way, and I certainly don't want to overemphasize it, but I want to mention it, that being too patriotic can actually be dangerous, and you can argue whether that's a good thing or not. Smollett certainly thinks it's a good thing, but then people die because of it, so who can say? Am I right? And we see the same thing with Jim, who is very patriotic and decides not to join the pirates when he's offered it, and the first thing he does on the ship is actually take down the Jolly Roger, which was sort of a real thing, and put back up a British flag, or put at least up no other flag, and so forth. So we see that patriotism for the British Empire, but the fact that it's not even mentioned as an empire, it's just taken as reality, I think is an interesting thing, because what we can learn from it, and what we can see, is that reality is very malleable in that specific way. And that's one thing I wanted to bring up. One final thing that I think is important and interesting is how it portrays British reality in some interesting ways. And that is British folklore, almost. See, we have people that work for the squire, his servants in a lot of ways, and they are portrayed as the ideal British servant, being, having a stiff upper lip, being somewhat being very trustworthy and sacrificing themselves, which is what happens to the gamekeeper, is the first guy dying in the book. So we have that in there. We also have the valet, who's almost played as a caricature, and this is, I guess, where Stevenson's abilities as a writer of fiction in general kind of run away with him, because I don't think that a 12-year-old would recognize almost a level of humor and satire that he puts into that, with the valet being first described by Dr. Livesey as probably not good at fighting pirates, and being a good man with brushing down clothes, and then even going into that with almost a caricature, asking what he should do if he sees people approaching the stockade, and being told to shoot, which he then does. So he's the first one shooting back at pirates. He also gets killed, because all the unimportant people get killed, but I still wanted to mention this specific aspect. And speaking of Dr. Livesey, that's, I think, another part that makes this kind of stand out, because while the main narrative is Jim Hawkins, talking about Jim Hawkins things, there is one part where Dr. Livesey takes over the narrative, and the prose style shifts massively, and suddenly we have this incredibly stuck-up, upper-class doctor talking in a very different diction, being arrogant as fuck, to put it mildly. And I think this is interesting, because it may also be seen almost as a bit of a caricature of teetotalism. In fact, one of the people originating the teetotal pledge of no drinking any alcohol was also named Livesey, which is interesting, because Livesey is constantly concerned about people drinking too much. And we can see these elements in there, which shows that while children's literature was a thing in the 19th century, there was already the idea that, sometimes adults will also read that. We need to put stuff in there that might be interesting to adults. So that's just like another thing that I found interesting and wanted to mention. One final part is, of course, Ben Gunn, the Maroon, being another sort of like staple of pirate fiction, people being marooned on islands. Having that, really cool. Being incredibly superstitious and having found to God because of their ordeal is another thing that is very accurate, because we find a lot of testimonies from different pirates talking about when they are in storms or other situations that they regret all their dreadful deeds and find their way back to God and so forth. That's another staple from pirate fiction that Stevenson managed to put into Treasure Island, and all of these, I think, combine to making Treasure Island such a powerful story. It takes a lot of already existing pirate mythology, turns it into a very straightforward narrative that is easy to follow, has some remarkable villains, with Long John Silver being, the classic pirate anti-hero, because, he survives at the end of the day while planning everything, but he's also, witty and a bit of a rogue and so forth. It introduces the key characters of any pirate fiction. It is fun to read. It is short enough. It has a relatively small group of key characters, those being, Livesey, Jim, Trelawney, Smollett, and Long John Silver, basically. That makes it easy to follow and easy to tell that story. And it combines both American myths about pirates and continental European myths about pirates. And those being, the people that then produced pirate movies, pirate stories, and so forth for the rest of the 19th and the 20th century. We can see how Treasure Island was such a focus that took the different and vague elements of pirate fiction, pirate non-fiction, and so forth, and turned them all into something that could then dominate everything about the pirate myth for the foreseeable future. So it's a really good book. It's a really important book. I enjoyed it. If you, I've read it so many times and know parts by heart at this point. If you enjoyed the book, let me know what you thought about it in the comments. If you have not enjoyed the book, let me know. If you haven't read the book, let me know. If you have anything else to add, let me know. If you have recipes for grog, let me know, because I gotta drink more of this. And no, I won't add battery acid. With all of that out of the way, like, subscribe, share the video, join the Patreon, join the channel if you feel like it. I'll talk to you about a different pirate book tomorrow, and until then, well, and cheers.